Okay, I'm from the Bristol Radical History Group, and I was asked to come along. Well, actually, to tell the truth, I was asked by Indie Media last year. We were talking about collaborating in some events and films, and one of the film they asked us, what kind of films would you like to show? And I said, well, I'd really like to show this film, Sir No Search, for a couple of reasons. One, because I think it's a really important part of history that's relevant to now, but also extremely important bit of hidden history, as you'll see when you see the film. The second reason is that it's a really hopeful film. Okay, so it's something that when I watched it the first time a few years ago, I came out, I kind of knew a bit about the history, but when I went to see it, I thought it's the first time I've actually seen it really visually and read a lot about it. So what I'm going to do is, before we show the film, I was actually prepared a little presentation here, which is not very long, but I actually prepared it to show after the film. Having chatted to people from Indie Media, they said that it's probably best to do it beforehand. So I'm going to do a little presentation now. And the idea of this presentation really is to try and flesh out a few of the things that you'll see in the film, to give you a bit more of a kind of statistical background to what the film's about. Okay, so I'll kind of press on. So really, what the title of this is Subversion of the US Armed Forces in the Vietnam War, 1961 to 73. I'm not going to talk much about the Vietnam War. I'm not going to talk about much of the history. What I'm going to concentrate on is what actually happened, what actually was the resistance of the US Armed Forces to that war. And I think perhaps you'll see in the film, quite a lot of really, really exciting things that happened. But this presentation will try and give you a little bit more idea about the scale of it and its importance in the future, after the end of the Vietnam War anyway. So this cartoon comes from a GI newspaper, of which there were over 300 newspapers and illegal underground press that occurred in the period of the Vietnam War. So it gives you an idea about their view. I think this is probably from about 1971, something like that, and it shows kind of soldiers and sailors approaching the Pentagon. Now, this is a quote. You'll see this quote a lot. In fact, it'll probably come up in the film, but it's quite famous. I'll just read it out. The morale, discipline, and battle-worthiness of the US Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse at any time in this century, and possibly in the history of the United States of America. By every conceivable indicator, our army that remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers and non-commissioned officers, drug-ridden, dispirited, where not near mutinous. Elsewhere than Vietnam, this situation is nearly as serious. And I just draw your attention, first of all, to the fact this is obviously a fairly high-up officer or in the US Army. June 1971, this date's important. Secondly, the last sentence is also extremely important. Elsewhere than Vietnam, the situation is nearly as serious. Okay, we'll come on to why that's important in a minute. So I just want to just quickly go through. That's my introduction done. Because I'm trying to be a historian, so I'm going to briefly show you where my sources are for this talk. I'll very quickly go through the phases of the resistance to the Vietnam War and the US Armed Forces. A few stats which I pulled together in the last few days, and most importantly, a few interesting misconceptions. Right? And I would say that most of my misconceptions come from watching Vietnam War films in the 80s and 90s, when it kind of got popular to kind of touch the subject. And finally, I'll talk about the historical effect of the movement against the Vietnam War within the US Armed Forces. Okay, sources, well, Sir No Sir, you're going to watch in a minute. Most important thing, we've got it here today, is this pamphlet, The Olive Drab Rebels. Okay, it's actually got two articles in it. The biggest one is called Olive Drab Rebels. It was written by Matthew Rinaldi in 1974, I think. And it was updated in 2003 by the author. Really, really interesting historical assessment of the resistance of the Vietnam War, the content of it, the kind of the anatomy of that struggle. Really. There's another article in it as well, which is called Harass the Brass, named after a GI newspaper, but actually was a leaflet that was given out in San Francisco in 2003, around the time of the start of the Iraq War. So kind of two sources that are really good. There's a few other books here. The Time for War is a standard kind of text about the Vietnam War, but kind of covers some of the resistance. The American War in Vietnam, this is kind of connected to the Socialist Workers' Party type of approach, but it's very good as well, particularly looking at the GIs after the end of the war as well. And finally, this article which I'll definitely draw your attention to, which is on LibCom, history part of the site. But really interestingly, this article went up, and it kind of contains a lot of the information that comes from the Olive Drab rebels. But really, really great is I just looked at it the other day, and a guy has come onto the site was posted on the bottom, and he was actually one of the people who organised the resistance on the USS Coral Sea, an aircraft carrier. And he's kind of spotted the article in the last few weeks and given a kind of oral history of what happened on the USS Coral Sea. So I definitely, if you get a chance, go to LibCom and find that article and look at the post underneath. Right, basically, 3 phases I think you can kind of divide it into 3 phases, this resistance that you'll see in the film. And the film kind of covers all 3. It pretty much starts in this early part of the war, between 61 and 68. At that stage, most of what the resistance that was going on was very much to do with moral positions. There were people, churches involved, people taking resistance on a very individual level, refusing to go and either train soldiers or refusing the draft for religious reasons, often for political reasons as well, but very much individual responses. Generally, it was isolated. Generally, the people involved in refusing to fight were either locked up or put in prison, or they were dealt with. They became cases in the media, but it was very much seen as isolated moral response to the war. Okay? And you'll see a lot of that at the start of the film. The second phase comes after the Tet Offensive in 1968, which is where the point where you could argue that despite the Tet Offensive, this was an offensive by the Viet Cong in the south of Vietnam to kind of try and, they'd been fighting a war of attrition. They decided to go on the offensive in 1968 in Tet. That military offensive was a disaster for the Viet Cong militarily, but politically it was a massive success because it was a moment where perhaps the public in the US first realised that the war wasn't really going the way that they'd been told that they were winning. They weren't going to win. It wasn't, a lot of it's to do with dramatic scenes on the television. For example, the US Embassy being seized in the middle of Saigon by the Viet Cong. So after 68, there is the rise of the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement starts to get big after Tet. There's a kind of misconception it was big in the early 60s. It wasn't really. And at that point, you start to get this rise in militancy, especially amongst GIs, and you start to see things like search and avoid. Right? They were meant to be on search and destroy missions in Vietnam. They start to kind of avoid combat. They don't want to go down the dangerous trail. They don't want to go to the dangerous places. People are trying to avoid it. You get kind of desertion, massive rise in desertion. I'll come on to that in a minute. In the US, you start to see attacks on officers. And this fragging, I don't really know this term, but fragging is basically throwing a fragmentation grenade into the officer's tent or mess to blow them up. Okay, this is US soldiers blowing their own officers up. This fragging is connected to this as well. Like if your officer wants to make you go somewhere dangerous on a mission, then he gets warned by the soldiers, we don't want to go down there, we know it's dangerous, we don't want to die, we don't want to get into combat. If that officer continued to do that, then they might get fragged. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of people start getting locked up, and you start to see stockade revolts. This is people who have done it for moral reasons, but also people who are refusing to fight start getting locked up. And you get a huge rise in underground newspapers, which is covered in the film really well. They've got great names. I don't know, All Hands Abandoned Ship, Star Spangled Bummer, and things like that. So really, really great. If you look in this pamphlet, you'll see loads of that. So that's kind of the rise of collective resistance, and it happens mainly amongst GIs, amongst the soldiers on the ground in Vietnam, but it also happens in the US, and it starts to be connected to the anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement kind of picks up on this in that period of 68 to 70, and they start to organise with soldiers. So contrary to the myths of hippies spitting on GIs when they came out of the airports in San Francisco, which is a complete and utter myth, instead, you get the anti-war movement realising that it's got to engage with soldiers, and that's a really important part of the resistance to the Vietnam War. And finally, 70 to 73. So, first of all, 68 to 70, you get expansion of the ground war. This is where they're putting, by 68, there are 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and of course, hundreds of thousands of people are passing through Vietnam all the time. A draftee does 2 years. A professional soldier, a volunteer, would do 3 to 4 in Vietnam. So huge numbers of American soldiers are going through Vietnam at that stage. By 1970, the whole thing's falling apart. Okay, you know, the US ground forces in Vietnam are literally collapsing, and that's where that quote comes from in 1971. Basically, we've lost morale. The morale's collapsed. Nobody wants to fight. They're murdering their officers. Okay, you get a huge amount, rampant insubordination, fragging, drug use, which we'll come on to in a minute, and absolute outright mutiny on the ground. And it's no consequence, and it's important to understand the dynamic of the Vietnam War. You know, I think a lot of the time people regard anti-war resistance as not necessarily having much effect, but the resistance of US troops actually changes war policy. Okay, it's not a surprise that in 1970, basically Nixon calls off the ground war. There's reasons for that, 70-71. And they go for an air war. They expand the air war, okay? And this is called Vietnamization. And the idea is like, they say, we don't want to engage US troops anymore. We'll go to an air war and we'll use the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, to actually do the fighting, okay? It's, you know, kind of, we'll use our proxies and we'll back them up with huge amounts of air power. Okay. But there's a reason for that. And that's partly because they couldn't fight anymore. The US troops don't want to fight, and they cannot force them to do it. And the more they force them, the more violent is their response against it. And finally, you get a change in the movement as a result. And this is very, very interesting. I'll talk about it in a minute a little bit more very quickly, but you get a very political response because suddenly you find that the Navy's involved. You know, they're sending aircraft carriers down there to bomb North and South, or parts of South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. And so there's all these naval ships going down there, huge numbers of aircraft carriers to supply the air power they need to do that. And the Navy's riddled with sabotage and protests through 1970 to 73. So just to give you an idea of some of those things. Just one quote from 1971 to give you an idea of that collapse. Okay, so since the end of the Cambodian operation last June, the United States Army in Vietnam has fought no major actions, launched no significant operations, captured no territory, and added no battle honours to its regimental flags. In the same period, the Army has abandoned at least one base under enemy fire and suffered most of its losses from accidents and booby traps. This was a journalist at the time. Vietnam has become a poison in the veins of the US Army. That's 1971. The ground war, effectively, as far as the US Army, is over. Okay, just some stats to give you an idea, which, again, backs up what's in the film. This is desertion rate in the US of GIs, effectively. So it's desertions per 1,000 troops. Okay, you can see, now, it's really important here to understand that the morale in the US Army in 1964 was probably the best it had been in the 20th century. Okay, it was probably the best. They had the lowest desertion rate in 1964, 63, 64 of the whole century. By you can see the rate here. 1966, 14.7 desertions per 1,000. It's low. It doubles almost every 2 years, right, up until 1971. And to give you an idea of the number of soldiers, you've got 354,000 soldiers have gone absent without leave in 5 years, right? At the end of the war, or at least when the peace accords in 1973, right, 98,000 soldiers were missing. 98,000, that's 5 divisions of the US Army have disappeared. Right? They're either in Canada or they're lost in America. You know, these figures are unbelievably high in the US Army. And another figure, very, very interesting, from the Pentagon, 64% of the absent without leave are enlistees. That's professional soldiers, that's volunteers. So 2/3 of the people who've gone AWOL are actually not draftees. They're not conscripts. They're professional soldiers, people who volunteered. It's a very, very important figure. A few more stats to give you an idea. Okay? This is statistics on fragging officers. This is like killing your officers, okay, with grenade attacks. And you can see, I mean, to give you an idea, 126 attacks in 1969, which there were 96 deaths. So this is 96 non-commissioned or commissioned officers that have been killed by their own troops. It goes up to 209 in 1970. These figures are unbelievable for a war in the 20th century, I would argue. Certainly, you know, if you have to go back to 1917 and the end of the First World War to see stuff like this in Russia, perhaps, or in Germany or in France or the British Army in Western Europe. 1971, I don't know how many deaths there were, but you can see the number of fraggings is going up. Okay. Also, really importantly, these statistics are only fraggings. They don't record, they didn't record friendly fire incidents, But the easiest way to kill an officer wasn't to throw a grenade in his tent, it was to shoot him in the back when you were in combat. So they don't record automatic weapons, handguns or knife attacks on officers. They know there was an awful lot of this. Okay? You know, very much like, I laugh about this thing, bounties, right? I know we did some stuff on piracy a few years ago, with Bristol Radical History Group, about how pirates, you know, obviously had prices on their heads, you know. The pirates responded by putting the price on the governors of the Caribbean's heads, you know, higher amounts of money on the people who were putting prices on them. In Vietnam, the bounties for killing your officers were ranged between about $50 to $1,000. And the way that would work is a unit, let's say the America 1st Division, Colin Powell's division, right? They would all get together, the soldiers, and they would put it in the newspaper. They would put their money in. Everybody put, you know, $5 in. You know, get $1,000 together and say, right, anybody, if you can do him, you get all the money, right? And this is what was going on all across Vietnam. Units are raising money to kill their officers. Hamburger Hill. You've seen this film. You know, this wasn't in the film, was it? The commander, the highest bounty ever offered for any officer in Vietnam was the commander at Hamburger Hill, and $10,000 was offered if you killed him. Okay, because of the suffering and misery he put his own troops through. And this way was a way of controlling those officers. Okay? It made them frightened. It made them think about, do I actually want to carry out this mission? You know, do I want to take my soldiers in there? Will I get shot in the back? I've got $1,000 on my head. So it was a way of controlling the military and what it was doing. In 1971, Colin Powell's division, America 1st Division, 1 fragging a week. That means they're blowing up 1 officer a week on average in 1971. Okay, and there's a reason why Colin Powell behaves politically the way he does about the US Army. And that's probably one of the reasons. He lived through that. Okay, he knows what the limitations of putting US troops around the world are, because he saw it in Vietnam. And finally, like 1972, you've got about 80% of the troops in Vietnam doing some kind of drug. I guess mostly marijuana and stuff like that. But about 30% of combat troops were taking heroin by that stage. You know, I mean, I don't know if you too personal, but if you're a bit of a smackhead, you're not really much good at fighting. So. You know, that's probably what I'd be doing if I was there. Finally, on the statistics front, I've put this together out of a few sources, and I've discovered some really interesting things. So this just gives you an idea. March 1970, so we're switching to this air war, which is being run out of aircraft carriers, and our Navy's been committed to this air war, bombing these countries illegally. Kissinger getting the Nobel Peace Prize, you know, while secretly bombing countries. In fact, Laos and Cambodia, I believe, are the 2 most bombed countries in the history of the world. That's what was going on at that stage. So just to give you an idea, the first one that really comes up, March 1970, SS Columbia Eagle. It's a ship that's been kind of commandeered by the US government, and it's taking napalm to Vietnam. And 2 of the sailors on it, they're not quite sure how many others were involved, but definitely 2 sailors on it, procured some weapons in Honolulu, and then took control of the ship as it went towards Vietnam. It's a famous mutiny. They took the ship to Cambodia, right, to try and hand it over to pro-communist forces. Right, so these are sailors. They're going, we're not going to take napalm to Vietnam to be dropped on people. We're going to take it and give it to the communists. And they believed they would be communist heroes. That's the first sign. Fairly small incident, important but small. After that, you start to get a huge amount of resistance, particularly in aircraft carriers. And this is mostly happening on the west coast of the States, in San Francisco and ports around Oakland. But what's going on is that this SOS protest, these are Stop Our Ship protests, they crossed across ships. There was communication between the ships on the west coast. They were basically protests. There'd be sit-ins, refusals to sail. GIs led marches. I think this march here, there was like 300 sailors from USS Coral Sea were involved in marching, and you'll see it in the film again. There's a kind of organised refusal to take aircraft carriers over to Vietnam. And then when that fails, or they fail to stop the ship sailing, you get sabotage. And the sabotage is pretty incredible. I mean, for example, the USS Ranger here, right, 3.5 months, right, it was disabled by throwing people through bolts into the main gearbox. It cost $7 million, right. This fire, they burned the USS Forrestal, an aircraft carrier, right? They burned it out. They burned the main deck, or the bridge, and the officers' mess. I think it was $7 or $8 million delayed it for 2 months, right? Also, what's going on in ships is that, and there's a serious amount of institutionalised racism in the Navy. You get rioting breaking out, and these are riots against like kind of the riots mainly by black sailors, but not exclusively, against the conditions on the ships. That's all coming off. So the whole thing's breaking down. The US Navy is going into kind of free fall in terms of discipline and control over it. And anyway, it kind of shows you what's going on in the Navy. And again, that is interesting. It happens at that particular period. So these people are not in danger. Okay, these people are not going into combat. They're not going to be shot at. They're completely safe. They could sit on an aircraft carrier. The only people on an aircraft carrier who are in danger are the pilots. And they're generally officers. And these are ordinary sailors who are not in danger, and they're taking an extremely serious and political stance against the war. Okay, right, just finished now, really. Just some misconceptions, okay? These are things that I kind of think that I would have believed up until I started getting involved in reading about this stuff a few years ago. First of all, morale in the US Army was already low in the early 1960s. No, it wasn't. It was very, very high. I've covered that. Morale in the US Army in the early 1960s was extremely high. Its conscripts, i.e. draftees, were the majority of deserters and mutineers. That's not true. We'll come on to why that is in a minute. The horror, I mean, if you've watched like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and all this sort of thing, you kind of go, oh yeah, you can kind of write off this GI movement by saying it was hell out there, their friends were being killed, the Vietnamese were, doing terrible things to them, and they were doing terrible things to the Vietnamese. So basically, if the horror of actual combat, kind of meant people resisted the war. Well, they did. I mean, it's definitely true, but it's not the only reason people resisted the war. That's a very kind of blinkered view about what happened. And finally, the movement was limited to the front line of the Vietnam Ground War. So it's kind of, these frontline troops, war is hell. Okay? They're all misconceptions. What really happened was that morale collapsed massively for a period, extremely fast, between 1968 and 1972. Okay? Secondly, that enlistees, i.e. professional soldiers, mainly drawn from the American working class, often that a much higher group, racial groups like Hispanics or black Americans who were kind of professional soldiers, i.e. they'd enlisted. They were the majority of the protesters, deserters and mutineers. Okay, this is professionals. Non-frontline personnel were a major part of the movement, absolutely true. Right, you'll see in the film as well that's true, which immediately tells you something about the content of the movement. And finally, the movement spread throughout the US Armed Forces across the world. This movement caused a wave of discontent throughout the whole way, from Germany to Southeast Asia, right the way across to the States, and everywhere US troops were garrisoned in the world, it had an effect. Okay, it's a very internationalist movement through the army. So yeah, basically to back that up, it's basically refusals, mutinies and desertion in the US Armed Forces were linked to a wider social movement. It's really important. I don't think the movement in the US Army, Navy and Air Force would have had its influence, would have had such power and been moulded the way it was unless it was connected to social movements that were already going on, obviously in the late 60s and early 70s. And I put including the anti-war movement. I mean, not exclusively to do with the anti-war movement. I mean, you've got to remember that period. Obviously you've got a feminist movement. American women soldiers were involved in it. You've got the civil rights movement, massively important in the American Armed Forces at the time. And effectively revolutionary movement that was going on in the US in the early 70s in particular had a major impact on it. So the anti-war movement was only part of that. Okay. The movement was mostly self-organised. It was GIs and sailors who got it together and did it. The movement was class and race conscious. Clearly, if you read the papers, you can see that in GI papers. And it was overtly political. This is to get beyond this idea that it was kind of this war is hell thing. It clearly was political. There's no way that sailors who weren't in danger would have got involved in the movement, or people on the ground back in the US would have got involved in it if it was purely the fact they had to be mentally traumatised by the war. Okay, that's the impression. All these GIs, oh God, these vets, they're all crazy. Well, clearly people seriously traumatised by the war, but the vast majority of people, a large majority of people involved in this movement didn't see any fighting at all, and were not traumatised by it. And finally it had this worldwide effect, which is really important. So just to finish now, say what the historical effect of this movement was. It's quite important. First of all, I mean, in my lifetime, this is kind of, you know, when I was growing up, I suppose, as a kid, but NAM finishes in 73, but effectively, technically in 75. But 73 is basically the end of the US involvement directly. And in that period, you know, the biggest operation they pull off, I think, barring Lebanon, which wasn't really a big deal apart from them getting hurt and all, was 1983 when they invaded this island of Grenada, you know, which has got a population of a couple of 100,000, I think. It's tiny, you know. There was this huge deal for Reagan to go into Grenada with US troops. Right? And we sat there laughing at the time when I was a youngster, thinking, well, you know, Christ, the US, this is the biggest army in the world, and it's managed to invade a small Caribbean island, you know. Been back to get a flight there and got on holiday, you know. I mean, it was ridiculous. But that's the effect that part of the effect this movement had. The end of that Vietnam War, which was affected massively by the armed forces movement, the resistance against it, causes American foreign policy to be completely limited militarily for a long time. Also, you see a change in military strategy. They move away from putting huge amounts of troops in, like the Korean War and Vietnam. They go towards mechanisation, special forces, the use of precision weapons, you know, the air war, and the use of proxy and mercenary forces, which we've seen a hell of a lot of in Iraq. But, you know, the idea of proxy forces in the 80s in Latin America. They don't commit troops in Latin America particularly, but they use proxy forces all over Latin America. There's reasons for that. Yeah. Why didn't they invade Nicaragua? There's reasons for that. Reorganisation of the US Armed Forces. This is a response to particularly the GI resistance, is that you get a move towards an all-volunteer army, no conscripts. You get pay hikes, they offer college tuition, skills-based training is offered to the working class recruits so they can go into the army and come out with something else. And finally, they attempt to address, I say attempt, to address institutionalised racism that's rampant in the 1960s. And that's their response. Now, I'll shut up now because I've gone a bit long. That's it, really.
Thank you.